All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the MSP Success webinar series. We've got a great topic. We've got a really great crowd that is piling into this webinar, talking about cyber insurance for the modern MSP. This is always a hot topic, always one of those that there's so much confusion that goes around with it. So I'm Jeff Johnson. I'm your host for these webinars here, and just a couple quick housekeeping items before I turn it over to Nick and Joseph, because they've got the real hot topics here to discuss throughout. So a couple things with it. One is that make sure if you have questions, we're going to have plenty of time at the end of this to go on to Q&A at the end of this call. So make sure that you post them up in the Q&A. We'll make sure that we get to all of those questions that you have. They may be, I think, Nick, it may be at the end of the webinar that we get to those here, but post them up. We will make sure that get all of your questions answered. If you just have something where you want to, post a quick comment or whatever else, feel free to do that in the chat there. But if you have questions, don't do it in the chat, do it in the Q&A. It's just easier for us to be able to catch them and manage. And before I get to these guys here, post up where you're listening in from today. So where's your MSP located? Where are you dialing into this webinar from? Post that to the chat here, not the Q&A there. So I'm seeing Connecticut from Doug, Georgetown, Texas, Oklahoma, Newark, New Jersey, Canada, all over the place. So there, Toronto, Austin, I'm thinking that's Boston, that was without a B, LA, so all over the place with it. So even McCall from Maui, Hawaii is dialing in. Probably not too late now, at least it's early morning for McCall there. So all right, you guys have a lot of great content here with it. So I'm going to get it over to you guys as quick as possible. And Nick and Joseph, why don't you take it away?
Wonderful. Hey, everyone. Welcome. I'm Nick Cavalancia. I really do want to introduce Joseph Brunsman. It's very interesting because every once in a while you actually meet someone who not only is an expert in their field, but actually understands the world that we live in as IT professionals. Joe actually had a couple of years that he was actually in IT. So he's actually very technical and understands the work that you're doing. And then, of course, is an absolute expert in cyber insurance. We had a lot of conversation about it. But Joe, I think actually you're going to do a better job than I would. So before we get into the webcast today, would you do just a brief introduction of yourself to the audience?
Yeah, certainly. So I am actually originally from Bethany, Oklahoma. So I saw Mark there's from Owasso. I've actually been to Owasso, Oklahoma, believe it or not. A little bit about my background: former IT, bachelor's in robotics from the Naval Academy, master's in cybersecurity law from the Carey School of Law. And then with that, let's see, I'm currently working on my 5th book. So I've written 2 books on cyber insurance and cybersecurity law. My 5th book is actually all about insurance for MSPs. So soon to be a quite riveting read. And then you guys can find me all over. So some of you may know me as Joe_cyber on Reddit. So I'm pretty active on the MSP subreddit there, just trying to help people out wherever I can. And then I've got a YouTube channel. If you just search for my name, I've probably got close to 80 some odd videos there, really revolving around cyber insurance, cybersecurity law, and then kind of some odds and ends of things that I just find personally interesting, like the science of hiring, how to actually talk to your clients about cyber insurance, all that kind of stuff. So it's all wrapped up into there. And then my wife thinks I'm a giant nerd because I actually like insurance, believe it or not. I find it interesting and fascinating. And honestly, like if I didn't get paid to do this, like I probably still teach people about insurance just because I think it's a super cool and necessary topic.
That's awesome. I usually introduce myself as a reformed nerd. I don't know if that even means anything to anybody, but I normally say that. I'm really glad you're here. So obviously you guys in the audience, you can kind of get a sense of, Joe's a kindred spirit here, and at the same time knows a tremendous amount about cyber insurance. So I want to talk to you just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. One thing is the folks at MSP 360 who are sponsoring today's webcast are giving away, I have it here, an Oculus Quest 2 VR headset. I want to make sure I got that right. So stay tuned till the very end, the bitter end perhaps, and I will announce whoever's going to be the winner of that. So make sure you're staying tuned for that. Also, as you heard mentioned, we are going to have formal Q&A time at the end, but this can be a little bit of a different kind of presentation. It's far more a discussion between Joe and myself. There's very minimal slides, so there's no death by PowerPoint here. There's not 78 slides in 22 minutes in one of those deals. Instead, there's a slide just kind of up on the screen as more a visual indicator of what we're talking about. And I've got some questions that I wrote down for Joe. We're going to do a little bit of back and forth and talk about this. And so I want to include you all in on the conversation. So if you use the Q&A, not the chat, again, because I don't have the chat open, I have the Q&A open in front of me. I'll be watching these questions. And if they're contextual to what we're talking about, I'm going to make sure that I bring those up, because why not bring it up while we're already having that conversation? And then, of course, whatever gets kind of left over, I'll do those at the very end. We'll have some formal Q&A time as well. So, so please participate. This is all for you. We want to make this as tailored as possible for you, so we get your questions answered and so on. And then there'll be some opportunity. Even I think I've got a QR code URL for some of Joe's books, as well as a URL if you ever want to reach out to him afterwards as well. So, so the agenda today is really simple. We got 4 things we want to talk about. I want to talk about, first differentiating cyber insurance with a tech errors and omissions insurance, and then who needs what in terms of what do you need, what do your customers need, that kind of thing. We want to talk about when you're trying to help your customers meet the policy requirements to be insured. What does that look like? What does that entail? Is that an opportunity maybe for you to offer another service? All those kinds of issues wrapped up in there. The rules that you should be following when there's a cyber event. You might think, well, I just respond to it. And you're actually going to find that's not the case. And Joe brings up some really good points about that. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk also about the role of backups when it comes to cyber insurance. So you already know it from a technology standpoint, I think, at this point, I'm going to guess. But we want to talk about how does that really looked at from a cyber insurance perspective. So our first topic today here is just the cyber insurance versus tech E&O insurance. And what I want to do, Joe, is I want to sort of level set the audience here. And I'm looking at my notes. I'm sort of cheating here because I'm assuming that there's a number of attendees that certainly they understand what cyber insurance is. They understand the concept of tech E&O insurance. But I'm thinking about more in practical application. You know, would you kind of provide the audience maybe a brief definition of each, and then we'll dive, of course, into that a little bit later into really the meat and potatoes of each one.
Sure. So, in these 2 types of insurance, actually very similar. And having written, really thousands of pages on these topics, at the end of the day, you can really describe it as 2 sides, 4 buckets plus exclusions. And that's really what it is. So both of these 2 sides, 4 buckets. The first side, somebody is suing you and they want money from you. So that could be regulators, it could be clients, it could be some sort of merchant like PCI DSS. The second side, 4 buckets, and that's what everybody kind of thinks of as cyber insurance. So that would be, there's a whole bunch of line items you could kind of throw into there, but briefly, they are data breach / some type of cyber event. The second is going to be ransomware. The third is going to be loss of funds. And that's where you really have to be careful, because that's where it starts going off the rails. The first 2 pretty well ironed out. There's some differences in policies, and I can split hairs being a nerd, but pretty well ironed out. The third one, it's all about what the policy defines that term as, right? So just because it says social engineering, that doesn't mean necessarily what you think it means. It could mean something entirely irrelevant, or it could be something that is very, very useful and crucial to you. The fourth bucket is going to be miscellaneous but situationally important. So that could be things ranging from bricking, cryptojacking, utility fraud, first and third party bodily injury, property damage. Important for MSPs, dependent business interruption, dependent system failure, right? So why is that important? Well, if the MSP goes down and their client can't generate revenue because of that, right? Whether it's a cyber event at the MSP or some type of unplanned outage or like a voluntary shutdown because a patch just went sideways, right? That recoups or helps the client recoup that lost funds. So what's the primary difference here? I always see MSPs they call me all the time. They're like, hey, I need cyber insurance. And I'm like, that's not technically true. And I know it sounds pedantic, but the primary difference is on that first side, right? Like, who wants money from you and under what mechanism would that actually be covered under a policy? So a tech E&O policy, it makes sense. The MSP provides some professional service to their client, right? So sysadmin, cybersecurity, right? Providing backups, so forth and so on. Something goes wrong there, right? Because that professional service was rendered. Client brings a lawsuit against him. So it makes sense that the MSP has a tech E&O policy. A cyber policy, right, also covers lawsuits against the entity holding that policy, but it's a different type of lawsuit. So the lawsuit would really center around, let me give an example. A CPA firm has, and this is something I'm actually dealing with right now, which is why it's top of mind. A CPA firm has a data breach. Okay. Then they send out all the breach notification letters and the credit monitoring. Then a class action claim pops up from their clients, right? The first side of that cyber policy is going to cover that class action claim. It's not because they were rendering services. It's because their clients are alleging some type of negligence. All right. So if it's a breach involving or a lawsuit involving, hey, we were damaged because of this breach, right? That's a cyber policy. If it's a lawsuit alleging, hey, we were damaged because you rendered or allegedly failed to render some service under your MSA or SOW, SLA, whatever you call it, that's going to be a tech E&O policy. So it's really important that MSPs actually understand what the two sides are broadly they're looking for, and then start kind of delving into those four buckets. And actually, just with that knowledge, you know more, unfortunately, than probably like 99% of the insurance guys out there, right? Like you can explain it in 5 minutes, something that may take hours of kind of fumbling around.
Great way to look at it is real simple, the two sides and four buckets. Now, I know most MSPs have sort of a niche, a customer niche that they focus on. Could be an industry vertical, could be a size of organization. They certainly have different types of data that they might be handling as part of their business. So I know this might be kind of a biased question because you're like, you issue insurance policies, you help write them, but which of our audience's customers should have a policy, and which of our audience members should have a policy?
So I guess the short answer is everybody. One of the primary, I have a very boring, but I would say crucial 37-minute insurance video, right? That people can look up. One of the primary risk transference mechanisms that we recommend, right, is contractually requiring their clients to carry cyber insurance. So for an MSP, it makes sense. Hey, you don't want to lose your business, lose your life savings, whatever the case would be, because somebody alleges you did something wrong, right? Or maybe your staff member misconfigured that firewall or didn't set up the backups correctly, or whatever that use case scenario would be. But likewise, you don't want your MSP to be the piggy bank for every time that end user as a client does something dumb on his lunch break, right? And as a former IT, I know it's always the end user that really keeps you up at night, right? Because God only knows what those guys are doing. So, effectively, you really want both entities to have insurance, right? It just makes sense. With that, actually, just today I put up a new video. I know a lot of MSPs, they're like, hey, once they watch that part of the video, they're like, I get why contractually requiring cyber insurance is a good idea, right? The primary elements there to bring a lawsuit against somebody, there's 3 things you need to do constitutionally, right? It kind of varies by state, but the gist is you need to show injury in fact. So like, hey, I got hit with ransomware, right? You need to show traceability, right? But for the error or omission, hence E&O insurance, of the MSP, I never would have been injured. Therefore, the third element is redressability, right? So what is that? Money. I want money to make me whole again. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to take the big dollar stuff, the big dollar things that they could bring a lawsuit against your MSP for, push that off to cyber insurance. All right, you're pushing that off to them. Now, obviously they can still bring lawsuits against you if you did something wrong, but the big dollar stuff should be taken care of. Now with that, there's always that very hard conversation, or people think it's difficult, right? Of, well, if I contractually require this, what happens if a client pushes back against me, right? And they're like, you want me to pay for this? Well, I pay you to keep me safe. Like, what's the deal here?
Feels like a racket a little bit. Yeah.
It does, right? And at face value, like, I understand, because I've dealt with, because I do obviously insurance for MSPs, and I also do cyber insurance for all types of clients that incidentally also happen to have MSPs. And so what I tell them is, listen, that MSP, right? They have a tech E&O policy. They pay good money for that, right? But what you don't want is some client down the road you don't even know exists. Let's say they wire $1 million to a bad guy. And now that firm owner is going, you know what? I'm like the 4th generation of my family to own this business. I got 20, 25 people working for me. Like, I'm not going to be the guy that loses the family business, right? So maybe his back's against the wall because he doesn't have cyber insurance. So he's like, I either go bankrupt or I go to my attorney and I say, hey, this is an extinction level event. What do I do? And that attorney just sues everybody, right? So if that happens, some client down the street, that could wipe out the E&O policy of the MSP. So then the client who maybe has a legitimate concern, right, there could be nothing left for them to actually sue for under that policy, right? So it's actually in every client's best interest. And there's 2 other reasons, which I'll skip here, just for the sake of brevity. But there's a very logical reason, right? Like, it's not just in your best interest as an MSP, it's in your client's best interest, right? That they actually want all of your other clients to carry cyber insurance. Because if they don't, right, the piggy bank at the end of the rainbow there, that could be completely exhausted. And then the client's just sitting there going, well, what am I going to do now? Right? Not a good position to be in.
That's good. You actually answered my next question, which is the same lines about what should every MSP carry tech E&O, but I think you've answered it. So, and that's quite well. So let me actually do this. Let's jump on to the next topic. And I've actually got a question from one of the audience members. I'm going to try and weave into this a little bit. But just talking about meeting the requirements for an insurance policy. Obviously, if an insurer is going to give out a policy, and if Hiscox says they're going to issue a policy out, they're not just going to go, we don't care how secure or insecure your client. It doesn't really matter. Here, you can have a policy because obviously there's a lot of risk there and a lot of likelihood of attack. And so I really want us to kind of dive into looking at what are those requirements. So what I wrote down here is, I know you've worked with a bunch of insurers, not just one. You've got you've had kind of a wealth of experience looking at what each one requires here. Are the prerequisites for obtaining cyber insurance? And I'm thinking about this from maybe like a people process technology standpoint, but are they the same? Are they vastly different? I mean, what does that look like? What could our audience gain a little bit from your knowledge around what their customers need to look like in order to get them a cyber insurance policy?
Sure. So to preface the answer to this question, I would like to think that cyber insurance companies actually know what they're doing, but they don't, right? So that's where I see, and
I knew that was coming.
I've dealt with, I won't say the name of the insurance company. I'm trying to make a case to the head underwriter at this cyber insurance company, and he's just not grasping what I'm talking about. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, I'm not the smartest kid on the block, so maybe I'm missing something here. Turns out the head underwriter at the cyber insurance company 2 weeks ago was writing insurance for motorcycle policies, right? So yeah.
Wow.
I've dealt with attorneys. Thankfully, this guy actually got fired, he was the complex claims specialist at a very well-known cyber insurance company. And he did not understand just the fundamentals of cybersecurity law, right? So we're not even getting into like kind of the niche gray areas, right? Where it's like super evolving and, you got to like cite case law to do that. No, like it was just, this is what breach notification laws say. There's data holders and data owners. Like he didn't understand that. So a lot of the frustration that I see MSPs have with cyber insurance carriers is because the cyber carriers don't really know what they're doing. A lot of it is just, it's all FOMO. They're like, hey, if we don't write this, somebody else will, and we're losing a lot of money, but we're going to take it on the chin with the hope that eventually we'll make money. Because let's say, Travelers is writing the cyber policy, right? But the Hartford isn't writing a cyber policy. Well, then a Travelers guy gets in there. Now he takes away the business owner's policy and the commercial auto, and he gets the life and health and all that kind of stuff, right? So when it comes to, so that was kind of the preface, right? So don't be shocked. Don't be shocked if it just doesn't make coherent sense.
That was part one of the answer. Okay, let's go to part two.
So part two there is they're still trying to figure out what works. So a lot of it's going to depend on that specific cyber insurer. So like we know specifically, there's kind of the broad brush. So basic controls like 3-2-1 backup strategy, for example, or like Hiscox Insurance Company. If you don't have backups, you shall not get cyber insurance, right? Pretty much point blank, because there's this huge co-insurance requirement. It just makes it completely uncompetitive. If you don't have 2FA, MFA for email access, right, to try and minimize the business email compromise aspect, like that is hard stop. You will not get any insurance. There's no co-insurance requirement, like nothing. It is, you either do this or you don't get it. So really all the fundamental controls that we all know about, that should all be implemented. And frankly, it's kind of a quick aside here for an MSP. If your clients don't have those fundamental controls in place, right, like 3-2-1 backup strategy, offline backups, 2FA, MFA, AV, blah, 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 they should not be your clients, right? Like you don't go to an architecture firm and tell them, hey, I know your safety margin here for this bridge is 20% load. I only want that to be a 5% load, right? They're going to laugh at you, then they're going to fire you, and then security will escort you out the building. Like it just doesn't work anywhere else but the MSP world, at least hopefully in the past. So you kind of have to stay Semper Gumby. Some of it really even depends on, like there's all these insurance companies I work with, I know what their general guidelines are. Sometimes it even just depends on the underwriter, like how they're feeling that day, how comfortable they are with that account, if they got sleep that night, what industry your client is in, how big is your client within that specific industry vertical. So, yep, Semper Gumby. I think we have a former military guy here.
Is that I'm assuming sort of quasi Latin for always flexible?
Always flexible. Yeah, sorry. 12 years in the Navy.
Yeah. Did he say Semper Gumby? Okay.
Yep.
Got it.
Yeah. So
I'm with you. I took Latin in high school. I know what that means. But see, it's interesting about this is, what one would expect from a cybersecurity standpoint that there would be, I don't know, like a framework, maybe leveraging something from NIST or, just something, right? That would say you have to have at least these basic sets of controls. But then you start thinking about, well, the whole idea of FOMO and wanting to write a bunch of policies. And if you're too restrictive as an insurance company, but nobody else is, who's ever going to use you because you require 17 things and everyone else only requires 2, but we all know, those of you in the audience, you're sitting there thinking, don't they have to be secure to get a cyber insurance policy? And that kind of thing. Is there any insurer that has something akin to like a framework? Or, obviously we got this list from Hiscox. You mentioned, 3-2-1 backups, 2FA, MFA, something along those lines. You mentioned antivirus in passing, I think. But is there somebody that has something even, let's say, I'll even say marginally more than that as their definition of what the client has to have in place?
Not formally. At least not something that the public at large would have access to. So they have their internal documentation. Those are constantly changing, just kind of depending on what's going on. And the difficult part here is, as soon as an insurance company sees like, oh my God, supply chain risk, that's a problem. It took them years to try and figure out, okay, because these are huge bureaucracies, right? It took them years to figure out, okay, what do we want to do about this whole business email compromise issue, right? Or what do we need to do with this ransomware issue, right? And then you have to think they're going to ask all these questions. They actually have to actuarially define to all the state regulators how much safer that makes you than not actually having that thing. And so it just takes time to build all of this up. And by the time they do that, and it gets through this huge regulatory process and everything gets filed and all the attorneys get their cut of the pie there, there's some new risk down the line where they're going, whoops, we didn't even know that this was going to be a problem. So it's very difficult. But what I would tell the MSP is, please take that cyber application as an opportunity to speak to your clients about those additional controls, right? Because every MSP, everybody watching this, they're going to know, hey, here are the things where I really think that client could benefit from, right? So what I always tell people is, hey, if an insurance company is asking about it, there's got to be something to this, right? So maybe we need to revisit these controls you're saying no to, because what they won't see, the client won't even see, is like the 30 declinations that hit my desk for a cyber policy, where insurance companies just go, hey, we're not going to quote this. And they're so busy, they will rarely tell you why, right? So it's like, you want to be able to maximize not only the odds that you would get a quote, you also need to start maximizing the odds that you're never going to use that policy. Because if you do, you are in for a rough few years. Like, counterintuitively, there was something called the actuary's paradox, where it used to be that your cyber premiums would go down after you got hit with some type of event. Because, yeah, right? It's like getting in a car crash and then suddenly your auto insurance goes down.
You're on edge now and you want to make sure that doesn't happen again.
That's what they thought.
Yeah.
But now it's like, one, the MSP, they're going to have to be more involved come around the renewal process, because increasingly there's just going to be continual demands placed, right? It's very difficult to forecast what that is. And then two, you're going to have to help that client really try and avoid that policy for kind of some reasons we'll probably talk about here in the future.
Yeah, let me ask you a question that's sort of related to that.
Mm-hmm.
And it ties both what we're talking about now and a little bit on the last slide. Tim says basically he wants his clients to be properly secured, but he doesn't want to be evaluating insurance policies for a living, which makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So what questions do I have my clients ask their insurance company to make sure they're covered as they should be against ransomware, hacking, and so on?
Yeah, so for that, so if we're talking about coverage features,
mm-hmm.
there's really only so much that an MSP should realistically get involved before it's, I hate to say it, because I understand, like, you're trying to be a good person, right? And you're trying to be a good business owner and you're trying to help your clients out. But at the end of the day, it's ultimately on your client and it's ultimately on that insurance broker, which, we don't attract a lot of Mensa members in the insurance industry. So I understand why people are like, So what I would say is, you understand the two sides in the four buckets, right? I've got a video on my channel that's how to understand and intelligently explain cyber insurance. It's like 10 minutes long. So you can take that video, you can pilfer it however to your heart's desire, you can send it out to whomever. And with that, at least empower your clients to be able to ask the right questions, right? When it comes to specific sublimits, amendatory language, all that other kind of stuff, that really just has to be pushed off onto the insurance guy, because if you get too involved in that process, one, you're just going to be wasting your time, right? Probably with unbillable hours to do that. But two, there's some regulatory issues. There's some insurance issues. Like, there's all kinds of potential problems for that.
Yeah, Tim actually mentioned his last client had $10,000 in ransomware protection from their insurance company, and obviously no one told them that wasn't enough. So that's kind of why he's mentioning that. Yeah. It's like knowing what questions, and obviously things like coverage and that sort of thing, it'd be, at least conceptually, not specific amounts of coverage, but it would be wise for you as an MSP to at least go, you should be thinking about, what it would cost you if that kind of thing happened in your business. But I think to your point, Joe, is sort of staying out of, being the insurance broker or trying to tell them what they need and that sort of thing, I think is your point. And let's talk a little bit about this from a post event. In fact, there's even a question that came in from Todd that I'm going to weave in here. Just looking at what MSPs should be doing when they follow a cyber event. They obviously have maybe incident response plans, or at least know they're going to respond and they can understand the scope of the problem. There's a ransomware attack and these 7 servers are encrypted, or, whatever it is from a technical standpoint. But then the question becomes, from an insurance standpoint, should they get involved? And you and I talked about this a little bit before, and I think you would actually advise them to probably not get as involved in the response, at least not in the way they're planning, as they think they would. Is that accurate?
That's correct. So quick step back to the last slide.
Yeah, sure.
I have a whole video on my channel where it's how much cyber insurance do I need? So like if an MSP gets that question,
Good.
you don't want to answer that. Just send them the video and just be done with it, right? Save yourself the time. Yeah, let's talk about what you can kind of do and not do after a cyber event. So you really have to be careful. And this is an area where, you know, like our dads growing up, right? You screw something up, what does your dad tell you? Or your mom? You own up to it, you fix the problem, you move forward, right? Or, hey, how do you succeed in business? You help people, right? The more people you help, the more business you get, right? That's really how businesses succeed. After a client cyber event, you really got to be careful because there's kind of some things you can do and kind of some things you can't do. And this is where I see MSPs getting in trouble because they're just trying to be good people. So unfortunately, the insurance industry is somewhat adverse to you being a good person. And here's why. Well, let me give you kind of the broad framework here. There's really kind of 3 steps that I think you should consider here. And those are identify, contain, and refrain. So let's just kind of go through those. Now, if you are a giant nerd like me, who apparently has this deep aversion to sleeping, although I do love naps, but it's been a few years, right? What do those breach notification laws generally say? Right, those breach notification laws, one, they're going to start detailing what's the difference between a data holder and a data owner, right? That's important for after an event, like who's really responsible for sending out breach notification letters, right? It's your client because they're the data owner. You may just happen to be the data holder, right? But also within those laws, they kind of have some requirements in there, right? The first one is, you can kind of boil it down to if you see something, say something, right? So if you're aware of a threat, you are required to tell the client, hey, we think something's going on here. So that makes sense from the identify standpoint. Step number 2 there is contain, right? Can you contain that threat? Whether it's, you know, just shutting the server down, ripping the Cat5 cable out of the wall, right? Whatever those immediate responses are. Yes. Right? That totally makes sense. Now, from that, what do those laws generally say? They say, hey, you can't just like stonewall an investigation. I don't think anyone's going to do that. Right? You kind of have to like play along. But you don't want to be in a position where you're potentially avoiding your policy. What would that be? Like giving legal advice, for one. So how could that even come into play? Well, let's say you spent all this time and money, right? And you finally talk that client into getting those backups, right? You're like, God, that took years. Finally, they're safer, thank God. Then they get hit with ransomware. And then the MSP, right, they go, hey, you know what? You remember all that time and energy and the money you put into getting backups. Well, you know what? Just tell that bad guy to go pound sand. We're just going to restore from backups. Now, how would you know without some sort of forensics background that there's not maybe a double extortion event, or there was an exfiltration of data before the ransomware event, or there's not, say, a third-party extortion event, or an attack loop, or all these other possibilities? What you have potentially done there is void your policy because, one, let's talk about that legal advice, you, in effect, conducted a de facto risk of harm analysis, right? That's the purview of attorneys. You don't want to be within a million miles of a risk of harm analysis, because if somebody asks me, what is personally identifiable information? It depends. It depends on where your client's client is a resident of, right? What is a breach? It depends. Right? You could have state laws, you could have federal laws, you could have, say, like the State Bar Association, right? Under the American Bar Association, they have a slightly different version. HIPAA has a slightly different version. So it all just depends, right? So you don't want to do that. You want to push that to the attorney. Likewise, the forensics analysis, that's actually assisting with creating a legal determination for that client. So you don't want to be in a position where you thought you were being a good person, you tried to help that client out. Turns out there was something extra there. Now, what's the problem? That client can come back at you for negligence, gross negligence to try and overcome your limitation of liability clause. They could have state regulators coming after them. They could have federal regulators coming after them. Now, all of a sudden, you thought you were being a good person, and I understand why MSPs want to do that, but now you're just in a world of awful. So this is just, but yet another good reason why MSPs have to contractually require their clients to carry cyber insurance. So don't be afraid.
Balance, Joe. It's interesting balance because the damage done, let's say, by a cyber attack might actually be remediated by just simply, let's say, doing a very successful set of recoveries, right? And then they're back up and running within an hour. I'm making up a really, positive scenario. And it's an interesting balance for the MSP because they might go, I can just fix this and I can have you back up and running in an hour.
Yeah.
And then they're not gonna have to go against their policy, versus it could be far worse. And this whole thing might go to hell in a handbasket very quickly or whatnot. And therefore the policy is going to have to be, a claim has to be put against the policy. And so I find it kind of interesting that there's just an interesting balance there. And I can definitely see where, from a forensic standpoint, depending on the type of attack, depending on what's been done, where the damage was done from like a technical standpoint, that the MSP getting involved and doing, let's say, recovery of even something like, I restored Active Directory to the way it was yesterday. And now all the accounts that the bad guy created, that would have been great for forensics to try and figure out what accounts they used and who did what. And was that person even here when that account was used and things like that, that's all gone. And so it's almost like early on, there really is that determination of whether or not their part of their response plan is to simply do the third part you said, which is to refrain. So
and then it gets even more complicated where, let's say the MSP goes, all right, Mr. Client, this is where our expertise ends and somebody else's begins, right? Like, yeah, we're both computer guys, but a neurosurgeon and a dentist are both doctors. You probably don't want one doing the other, right? Because there's really some specialization there. Well, what does the MSP do if their client goes, yeah, I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to tell cyber insurance. I don't want to spend the money for the deductible. I don't want to spend my retention. I don't have to deal with this issue at renewal. So, hey, MSP, you just restore the backups. What does the MSP do then? That gets into something called an exculpatory agreement. And once again, this is where...
Let me interject a question because it's right where you are in this conversation. Because Mark's saying, so how do we protect our customer, ourselves and the client? Should we call the insurer before we attempt any restore? And just going to maybe use that to kind of color the rest of what you're talking about.
Yeah, certainly. So, it's, hey, this is where the MSPs, like, their expertise ends when it comes to legal recommendations, when it comes to restoration, right? I've seen a lot of instances where MSPs kind of get into a battle with the forensics guys and vice versa, because after some event, an MSP is naturally trying to do everything they can to bring that client online, and it makes the forensics more costly and more lengthy, and it's a pain, right? So generally it's, you tell the client, that's their bailiwick, right? Like, this is their lane, this is our lane. So we're here to assist you, right? So, like, you talk to your people, they need to tell us what they want to do, right? To preserve forensics evidence, right? To make sure that you're back up and operating as soon as possible. We have our own ideas, but sometimes that could conflict with what an attorney may think is best or reasonable in that situation, or what the forensics guys think in terms of preserving that evidence. And so, hey, we're here to assist you, but you're going to have to get guidance from that attorney, from those forensics guys. And then with that, talk to them and we'll help you moving forward, right? Under their guidance, for sure.
Cool. Let's do this. Let's go to the last topic we got today. So we have a little time for a bit of information from our sponsor, and then you have one last thing you wanted to add? Go ahead, please.
Sorry, one last thing. If the client goes, hey, I'm not going to use my cyber insurer, I just want you to restore from backups. That gets into something called an exculpatory agreement, which is like a liability waiver. All right. So I understand, hey, maybe it's the MSP's biggest client, right? And the MRR there is just outrageous. And they're like, hey, we don't want to piss these guys off. Well, you still need to protect your butts, right? So you need to go talk to your attorney. The rules vary by state, so don't borrow a limitation of liability waiver from one of your buddies. Talk to your business attorney, have them draft something. You may also want to consider that a potential claim to your tech E&O insurer, right? So you're going to want to run it by them. But effectively, that agreement's going to say, hey, you know what, like, we've warned you. You're saying you want to proceed anyways. We're not going to be held liable for this. Please sign here. And if you get pushback, blame your insurance company because they will crucify you if you do not do that.
Good to hear. That's good information. So let's talk about this last topic here, the idea of backups. We've already talked about backups a little bit. It's been kind of smattered throughout the conversation today. And I think of backups from a technical standpoint of a way to put, and I think our audience as MSPs do as well, a way of putting an environment back to what I call a known good environment. It's functional, it's productive, everything is working together, but also a known secure environment, meaning like my example of restoring Active Directory to yesterday before the attack, so that way you know that the accounts haven't been modified and those kinds of things. But how do you see backups from kind of a cyber insurance perspective? You already talked about Hiscox saying no backup, no policy, but how else do they see that in terms of from their perspective?
Yes. So there are obviously all kinds of very practical reasons, right? Which you've touched on. I'm sure all the MSPs here understand to have backups. But there's also I'll say, very little known in the broader business community reason. So inside of all of these cyber policies, and you probably have them in your business owner's policy and all this other stuff, there's something called an OFAC notice. That's OFAC. That comes from the Department of Treasury. So there are essentially rules out there that say, hey, if your client gets hit with some strain of malware that is on this OFAC sanctions list, so that could be, malware coming from North Korea or Iran, or it's only a matter of time until more of Russia's put on there. There's already some that are in there. It is literally illegal to pay the ransom. So their insurance company, they're going to find that out in a quick hurry from the forensics. If that were to occur, it's illegal to pay the ransom. There is, if you look into the law, there is a waiver that you can apply for. And then I will just tell you that the waiver says there is a presumption of denial. So it's probably not going to happen. What does that really mean in practice? If your client has a lobbying group on Capitol Hill, right, to be somewhat cynical here, yeah, maybe you'll get that waiver. If they don't, they damn well better have backups, because at that point, the insurance company is going to go, hey, I'm not going to have the United States government sanction our insurance company because, Bob's Auto Shop or whatever it is got hit with ransomware, right? Like, we will not do that. And it's in the policy where they say, hey, we don't have to do that. So that's just, I think, probably the most prominent area where I think business owners, they kind of lose the plot, right? Because they go, hey, we have cyber insurance. My insurance guy said it'll pay the ransom. And it's like, well, yes, with a caveat, and that's a big caveat. So what are the odds that your client gets hit with, let's say, ransomware to begin with? Nobody really knows statistically. What are the odds they get hit with something on the OFAC sanctions list? I have no idea. But what I do know is that last time Russia invaded Ukraine, we had the NotPetya virus, and that did like $10 billion worth of damage and launched some just outrageous court cases around the world. If the Russian government were to start playing in the cyber world again, and I think they've been pretty reserved so far, who knows what's going to happen, right? Or if some of these other criminal enterprises say, hey, we're going to take this opportunity of chaos to generate more chaos, to generate revenue, your clients could really be in a bad spot. So I think that's one of the key mechanisms that MSPs need to be able to communicate to their clients to say, hey, this is why you don't just need one backup, right? It's not that good, right? Also, criminals are increasingly encrypting backups anyway. So you need to have additional backups because it's just going to make your life easier. And then practically, even if cyber insurance does restore you and pay for all this stuff, you want the loss to be as low as possible, right? So the more backups you have, the more types of backups you have, if you have offline backups, the better it becomes for you, because now you have those backup plans really to try and limit the loss on the front end, recover on the back end, but then at renewal, The bigger that dollar amount, I'll just tell you, when you start getting into six figures, good luck. Good luck at renewal. It's
Yeah, and there's also, you mentioned the Russia connection, and one of the things we're seeing now are like, especially in Ukraine, and there's some thought about it might come to the US, is these wiper malware. So rather than it being a ransomware attack, it's going to be a data destruction attack. And obviously in that case, there is no possibility of just paying a ransom and getting recovery. It's, we've wiped everything out and you're going to have to restore. So let's do this, because I know we have about 14 minutes left, and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to move us along a little bit here. Joe has 2 books that are available for free on his website. I made some bit.ly links here. Those are case sensitive, of course. If you have your phone, you can use the QR code and you can go, takes you right to where you can register for the ebook. And then also, I wanted to make sure that you all know how to get a hold of Joe if you'd like to reach out to him. We have some other questions about insurance policies for your customers or yourself and that sort of thing. So Joe, just before I hand things over to Seth with MSP 360, just to talk a little bit about how they help with backups. Can you kind of really quickly summarize sort of everything we've talked about in 30 seconds or less somehow?
I can, yeah. So let's see here. Foremost, make sure you have the right type of policy. That's going to be a tech E&O policy. It's not a miscellaneous policy with a tech E&O endorsement. Tech E&O policy, 2 sides, 4 buckets. You know more than your insurance guy. Next, meeting policy requirements to be insured. Make sure you have all those fundamentals down. If your clients don't have those fundamentals, you really need to think about maybe firing those clients, or I guess a better term is disengaging. But likewise, there's going to just be more and more requirements, depends on the insurance company. So Semper Gumby is the phrase of the day there. After a cyber event, identify, contain, refrain, right? Those are really the 3 crucial parts, with contractually requiring clients to carry cyber insurance. And then please just make sure your clients have backups. That's just another one of those where if you have clients that don't have backups, they just shouldn't be your clients, frankly, right? If they're not taking the threat seriously, and I'm serious, right? Because if you have a lawsuit as an MSP because your client didn't want to pay for backups, you are now almost uninsurable as an MSP. When MSPs come to me and they go, hey, I need a tech E&O policy this year, I had a claim last year, right? And that loss run lasts for 5 years. So don't put your business at risk because, whatever business didn't want to pay for backups. Like that is not a good thing for you. Bunch of other stuff on my YouTube channel where you guys can find that. And of course, download those books for free. None of that actually goes through my website. I'm not going to email you with insurance nonsense because I hate that stuff. But I think that's my quick recap.
And 30 seconds on the mark. Perfect. Well done. Good job.
Awesome.
So I'm going to hand things over for a couple of minutes here over to Seth Hartness from MSP 360. And while Seth's talking, if you've got any questions about anything he's talking about or anything that we've already talked about, I still see some questions in the queue. We'll have some formal Q&A time at the end. So with that, Seth, the floor is yours, and I'll be happy to click through your slides.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I won't take too long, guys. Just a couple quick highlight points of the MSP 360 and how we're trying to combat the ever-growing threat of ransomware. So real quick, from the ground up, we built the product with 3 things in mind to make it powerful. Basically, we cover all commercial OSs that you guys are going to be working with on a day-to-day, whether it's Windows, Linux, Mac. Make it affordable. Our desktop pricing starts off as a little $5 per month. We allow you to utilize the public storage landscape to make sure that you guys are paying the least amount possible for the storage that's being hosted. And in turn, you can pass along those savings to your clients. And lastly, to make it universal, again, to briefly touch on it, we cover all commercial OSs. Pretty straightforward there. So basically, as long as it's running Windows, Linux, or Mac, we're able to cover it on our side. Back one real quick, Nick. That's the big one. So on this side here, just kind of the quick high-level overview as to the things that we've introduced to combat the threat of ransomware. Number one being we've introduced immutable storage with both AWS and Wasabi. Just ensuring the fact that those backups are completely offline, so to speak, or air-gapped, however you want to word that, which leads me into the next step of 3-2-1-1-0 backup methodology, allowing you to have 3 copies of your data, 2 of them being backed up, 1 of them being off-site, the last one being immutable, with 0 errors within the process, ensuring the fact that you have consistent recovery across the board. I'll jump forward 2 bullet points to the restore verification. We're able to just quickly run quick download essentially of the necessary pieces of that machine onto a VM that's running locally. Spin up, get to the boot screen, ensure the fact that backup is healthy. You're able to recover from it and continue on as business as usual. As these guys were saying, previously, get back to a known safe or a known secure point in the backup history. In terms of the RPOs, we don't really limit any of the scheduling parameters. A lot of it's going to be network dependent, whatever your bandwidth is able to uphold. So I have a lot of clients that run backups every hour, other clients that run backups every couple of hours. It's really just dependent on whatever that network's able to keep up with. And then lastly, the GFS methodology, just allowing you to host longer periods of retention, depending on whatever compliance or insurance regulations that you guys may have, while still paying the lowest possible amount of money to ensure the fact that those backups are still safe. We'll go ahead and jump forward to the next one, Nick. Thank you, sir. Real quick, again, briefly touch on it. As long as it's running Windows 10 or above, Windows Server 2008 or above, Linux, all different distributions, and then Mac OS, we're able to cover it. We also have an RMM solution that's strictly Windows at this point, and the RMM solution is also coming for Linux and Mac. And after establishing baseline, functionality all the way across the board on the main 3 OSs, we threw in application support for Microsoft SQL, Exchange, virtualization support for VMware, Hyper-V, hosted solution backup like Office 365 or G Suite, depending on the compliance. They may also need to back that up as well. And then my last key point is just in the case of ransomware, obviously we want your data to be safe, offsite in a safe location. And that's really where the public storage landscape comes into play. So we don't dictate where you put your data, whether it be locally or the cloud, any mixture of the two, it really doesn't matter. I have many clients that utilize a mixture of maybe AWS and Wasabi or Backblaze and Azure. At that point, it's completely up to you, however you want those backups to be scheduled on the back end. And all of this is done from a single pane of glass SaaS console. So you're able to manage all of your clients' data from one screen. A couple clicks through, just managing everything from one place. And that's the quick overview on MSP 360 Managed Backup and our platform as a whole. Obviously, feel free to reach out to our sales team if you guys have any questions. And the next slide's just going to be confirming that you guys are entered to win the Oculus Quest 2.
Sounds good, Seth. Thank you very much. I do have our winner here of the Oculus. I can never say the name right. I've got here Oculus Quest 2 VR headset. It's a lot of words for just a really cool headset. The winner is Douglas Luban. I hope I said your name right, but you are the winner. The rest of you, you're still winners or whatever, but just not of the Oculus Quest 2 VR headset. You're just winners in my mind. Anyways, if you want to have more information, you can reach out to sales@msp360.com or visit msp360.com as well. And so we're going to take a couple of questions here. We've got looks like about 7 minutes left. So I'm going to go and let me see if I can scroll back up here. Joe, one of the questions came in early on, but I wanted to wait here till the end. And I think we've kind of answered this a little bit between the insurance companies don't know what they're doing. And then at the same time, the refraining, they don't want the MSP doing anything. But the question was, why is it that when we question an insurance company about their playbook, talking about a response playbook, so we can plan ahead and include these steps in our IR plan, the representatives are very vague and give us a response like an attorney?
Yes, because it is run by attorneys. And I guess the short answer here is it just depends. I mean, so one, legally they cannot put out like we shall do X, Y, or Z. Because then they're going to be held to that by a legal standard. So even if you ask an insurance company like, hey, what does this policy phrase mean, right? They're going to say, we don't opine on our own insurance language, right? Which is really where people like me step in, and that's why we have our own, insurance. But two, it just depends on the event, right? No one event is the same as another event. Like it just depends. And I know that's not a very good answer, but there's so many variables that go into it that you could have, let's say, the same type of information from two different people both get stolen, one gets a breach notification record, the other doesn't, because they're residents of different states. Like it even gets that granular. And then from there, there's all types of, you can actually read about it in my book where there's different thresholds at various regulatory levels on who at what threshold for how many people has to get notified. There's different offices within each state. And then some states are super activists in this area, some aren't. So it's just, I know that's not a good answer. I know it's kind of a non-answer type of answer, but it really just depends. So I would say, one, make sure you're getting, you're billing appropriately for the assistance that you're rendering, but two, just Semper Gumby. It's probably the best way to put it.
There was another question came in, and maybe I'm going to rephrase Mark's question here, but just in essence, could you very quickly just go back over the 2 sides and the 4 buckets?
Sure. So 2 sides, 4 buckets. And I'll go with, well, I'll say it this way, 2 sides, 4 buckets. First side, somebody is suing you because they want money from you. Regulators, clients, PCI DSS is an example. There's some like media liability potential there, although very rare. The second side, and this is the same for both, right? First is going to be all the coverage options that go into a data breach or a cyber event, right? So that could be like theft, right? Access and acquisition of covered information. It could be a business email compromise. It could be little Timmy has a new toolbar on his PC that he didn't know was there before, right? Like some Yahoo toolbar, whatever it was like in the late 90s. The second bucket, ransomware. Third bucket, loss of funds. Got to be careful there. It depends on the type of loss. Fourth bucket, miscellaneous but situationally important, right? So that could be like reputational harm. So it could be after a data breach, client loses a bunch of their clients, reputational harm comes into play there, tries to reimburse them for the difference in revenue. The difference between the first side on tech E&O and cyber, the type of claims they will cover. So if you're an MSP, you do not want cyber insurance. You want tech E&O insurance because that is going to cover claims where they said, hey, you somehow screwed up the professional services you rendered, or you failed to tell us that something was an issue, right? So we didn't prepare for it. Cyber claims on that first side, right? That's like, hey, because my information was stolen, my identity got stolen, and somebody opened up a credit card in my name and they destroyed my credit. So now I'm going to bring a lawsuit against you. So very briefly, MSP should have a tech E&O policy. MSP's clients should have a cyber policy.
Cool, good stuff. And I'm gonna one more question I'm gonna do, and then we're gonna probably close it up here. And if for some reason I didn't get to your question, either Joe or someone from MSP 360 will reach out and make sure you get your question answered. So don't worry about that. But Todd asks, so how does a company know what to do when an incident occurs? How are we supposed to have a well-documented IR plan, and the insurance company is going to look for these details and try to pick it apart when we have no details from the cyber insurance company? What would you recommend? Where's the happy medium from the MSP perspective, so they can at least do some kind of IR plan, but at the same time, they're not going to, they're maintaining that refrain that you mentioned early on?
Sure. So most cyber insurance companies, they have, it's like a 1-800 number. It's really more of like a 911 call where the client needs to call that 1-800 number. Generally on the other end of the phone is going to be an attorney who's going to assist with that immediate action response, right? From there, generally the MSP will either be tapped into that phone call so they can ask more technical additional questions. Now, they're not going to get super into the weeds, but once again, you know, you can only go so far before really it's your client's prerogative on how they want to advance, right? And they're going to need the full legal advice, all the evidence rendered by the forensics examination to really make the best determination. So I understand that, hey, as an MSP, you want to get that client up and operating as quickly as possible. However, you got to play within the lanes that are really given to you. One of those is, you know, they have to go through forensics. One of the questions here was, you know, what happens if they're like, hey, I don't need insurance, I'll just buy new computers. Short answer there, I have an entire presentation on why hiding a data breach is a really bad idea. Part of it is that client and the MSP, quite frankly, and myself, we have zero idea what is going to happen and the fallout from that. So federal regulators for example, went after a car dealership under the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which was written for banks and financial
Wow.
institutions. And this stuff is evolving all the time, right? So it's something where, you just have to tell the client, like, there's so many ways that this could play out that's just not a good idea. And if they're just hard pressed and they say, I don't care what advice you're telling me, or I'm not going to notify my cyber insurance company, that is when you get that exculpatory agreement on the table, because you got to cover your butt or you're going to get in a whole lot of trouble.
Very good. With there's a couple questions I think in the queue, but we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and close things out. But again, someone from MSP 360, or if Joe has the opportunity, someone will reach out to you and get your question answered. And with that, I'm going to pass things back to Jeff to close us out. Jeff.
Right, you guys made my job easy today on this call. This is fantastic information, Joe, and Nick
Thank
as
you.
well with it. A great interview with it, and we're going to post this up on mspsuccessmagazine.com. You'll have this, and if you wanted to pass this along to anyone else here in your organization, we're going to be emailing out a recording of this along with anything else that was offered up, the links and whatever that were in there, including Joe. We'll make sure we get your links in there so they don't have to dig through the PowerPoint or the video to be able to get that. So all of those are going to be delivered right to your email inbox just as a thank you for registering for this webinar. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up for today. Thanks a ton, guys. Thanks for everyone that was out there participating on it. A ton of great questions that were here today. Hope to see many of you at the IT Sales and Marketing Bootcamp here in 2 weeks. And we'll be back with the MSP Success webinar series the week after that. Thanks all.
Thank you all.